Who decided who was barbarian? The word barbarian was never neutral. In ancient China, nomadic tribes beyond the Great Wall were described as uncivilized threats. In Persia, they were outsiders without law. To Rome and later historians, they were chaos itself. But the label said more about fear than fact. Barbarian simply meant foreign, unfamiliar, uncontrolled. These tribes did not live in cities. They did not farm land permanently. They did not follow imperial bureaucracy. And because they could not be controlled, they were demonized. History begins with a warning. When a powerful society cannot understand another way of life, it often calls it barbaric. Across the vast steppes of Central and East Asia lived tribes like the Xiongnu, Scythians, Huns, Turks, and early Mongols. Their world was not built with stone, but with movement. They followed seasons, not borders. They lived in felt tents, not palaces. Their wealth was measured in horses and herds, not gold. Family units were tight. Loyalty was survival. Leadership was earned through strength, wisdom, and generosity, not inherited titles. Spiritual beliefs centered on the sky, nature, and ancestors. These were not lawless people. They had customs, justice systems, and codes of honor passed down orally, not carved into monuments, but to empires that worshipped walls and permanence. Mobility looked like disorder. For nomadic tribes, warfare was not sport, it was survival. Harsh environments offered little mercy. Drought, cold, and scarcity forced constant movement and competition. Weakness meant extinction. These tribes became master warriors out of necessity. They perfected mounted archery firing accurately while riding at full speed. They developed composite bows, stronger than anything imperial armies had seen. Their cavalry could strike, disappear, and return before enemies could regroup. Empires with massive armies fell to smaller nomadic forces not because they were more cruel, but because they were more adaptive. Violence was not celebrated, it was required. Imperial records describe these tribes as ruthless, merciless, inhuman. Some accounts were true. Cities were destroyed, populations suffered, fear was real. But fear was also exaggerated. Empires used stories of barbarian savagery to justify walls, conscription, taxation, and expansion. Fear unified populations under rulers who promised protection. The truth is uncomfortable. Fear was a weapon used by both sides. Nomadic tribes understood reputation. Sometimes terror prevented resistance and saved lives through surrender. Psychological warfare replaced prolonged bloodshed. In a world without international law, fear was strategy. Now comes the naked truth. Few empires admit. So-called civilized states committed massacres, enslaved populations, destroyed cultures, and expanded through brutal conquest. Cities burned, prisoners were executed, forced labor built monuments, praised today as symbols of greatness. The difference was not morality, was branding. When empires killed, it was called order. When outsiders killed, it was called barbarism. Violence was universal in ancient history. The label barbarian simply hid the mirror. History proves the lie of primitiveness. Many tribes, once called barbaric, went on to build structured states and empires. The Mongols created the largest contiguous empire in history. Turkic peoples established powerful khanates and later Islamic empires. The Manchus ruled China for centuries. They developed administration, diplomacy, taxation, and trade networks connecting continents. These were not people without intelligence or culture. They were people without walls until they built their own. This story is not about heroes. It is about people. Farmers displaced by raids. Nomads wiped out by imperial campaigns. Children raised in war zones. Cultures erased from memory. Brutality harmed everyone, tribal and imperial alike. History's greatest victims were never kings or khans. They were ordinary humans caught between power and survival. Barbarism is not a race. It is not a region. It is not an identity. It is what humans become under extreme pressure when survival outweighs compassion, when fear replaces understanding. The Asian tribes, once labeled barbarian, were not monsters. They were humans shaped by environment, conflict, and history, just like every civilization that judged them. Modern Asian societies are not reflections of ancient wars. History must be studied to understand humanity, to justify hate. This is Naked Truth documentaries, where myths are stripped away and history is